Good evening, I'm Nick Schifrin. Jeff Bennett and Amna Nawaz are away. On the NewsHour tonight, remembering the life and legacy of former President Jimmy Carter, one day after he died at 100 years old. Crime in decline, the reasons behind a sharp drop in the number of murders in 2024. And bucking the trend. In a world of consumerism, social media users advocate for buying less.
It's rejecting what influencers and the companies behind them are trying to get you to do, which is buy more and buy it right now.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions, and friends of the NewsHour, including Leonard and Norma Chlorfine, and the Judy and Peter Bloom Kovler Foundation. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, for more than 50 years advancing ideas and supporting institutions to promote a better world, at hewlett.org. And with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome to the NewsHour. Former President Jimmy Carter tonight is being remembered as a humanitarian and statesman more than 40 years after leaving the White House. The 39th president, who died yesterday at 100, will lie in state at the U.S. Capitol next week before his funeral at the Washington National Cathedral. Laura Barone-Lopez begins our coverage.
Flags were lowered to half-staff across the country and around the world. And Americans of all backgrounds paused to remember late former President Jimmy Carter.
Jimmy Carter has always been a hero of mine.
He was just a good man, a decent man, an honest man, something we don't see very much of anymore.
He was a great humanitarian. He set an example for all of us, and we're going to miss him.
From peanut farmer to president, Carter served one term in the White House. From 1977 to 1981, he brokered a historic peace deal between Israel and Egypt. But an energy crisis at home and the kidnapping of 52 Americans in Iran led to his defeat in 1980. Carter's life post-presidency was defined by his international humanitarian work. He and his wife Rosalind founded the Carter Center, and he earned a Nobel Peace Prize in 2002 for his diplomatic achievements. Last night, President Biden broke from his family vacation to pay tribute to his longtime friend.
Millions of people all around the world, all over the world, feel they lost a friend as well, even though they never met him. And that's because Jimmy Carter lived a life measured not by words, but by his deeds.
Former presidents from across the political spectrum also weighed in. President-elect Donald Trump has been critical of Carter in the past, but he wrote last night that he truly loved and respected our country and all it stands for. Former President Barack Obama said that Carter believed some things were more important than re-election, things like integrity, respect, and compassion. The former president will be laid to rest in his hometown of Plains, Georgia, next to his wife of more than 75 years, Rosalind, who passed away in 2023. One of the couple's final public interviews was with the NewsHour's Judy Woodruff back in 2021.
As you think back on your presidency and your time as a former president, what are you most proud of, and is there a big regret you have?
I would say that we did what we pledged to do in the campaign. We kept the peace, and we obeyed the law, and we told the truth, and we honored human rights. Those were the things that were important to me.
For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Laura Barone-Lopez.
And for more on President Carter's life and legacy, I'm joined by Judy Woodruff, who you just saw there and has covered the Carters for more than 50 years, as well as James Fallows, Carter's speechwriter during the first 2 years of the administration, and Kai Bird, author of The Outlier, The Unfinished Presidency of Jimmy Carter. Thanks very much to all of you. Welcome back to the NewsHour. Judy, let me start with you. Jimmy Carter grew up on a peanut farm, no electricity, no running water, the first member of his family to graduate high school. Just remind us, how far was his journey to the White House?
It was the longest imaginable journey, Nick. You're right, a peanut farm in the deepest of rural southwest Georgia, Plains, the town that we've all come to identify with him, to reach the pinnacle, the most powerful job in the world, and unimaginably to leave office in a state of, if you will, political failure, not winning re-election. But then here we are 44 years later, and we are celebrating the life, the legacy of this man who did come from that very simple beginning, but against all odds achieved everything that he achieved.
Kai Bird, against all odds, as I said, you called your book The Outlier. How was Jimmy Carter an outlier?
Well, he was an outlier for all of the reasons that Judy just explained. He came from these very Spartan circumstances, no running water, an outhouse. He was virtually raised in the 19th century and now has lasted 100 years into the 21st century. And, you know, he was an extraordinary man, but I think Judy and Jim will all agree that he was just relentless. He was a workaholic. He, you know, in the White House, he was devoted to figuring out the right thing to do and studying the memos. He would read 200 or 300 pages a day. And I don't know, you know, Jim saw him on a more daily basis. I was just the biographer, but, you know, he could be acerbic and difficult. People have this warm and fuzzy thinking of perception of him, but he was a tough guy to interview, precisely because he was so smart and quick and knowledgeable.
Jim Fallows, you wrote some of those memos. You were in the White House at the beginning. Carter came to power after the twin traumas of Vietnam and Watergate. He promised never to lie and to help heal America. At first, did it work?
It did work at first. And I think something that's very difficult for people now in America who think of Carter only as this grandfatherly figure wearing a cardigan, you know, doing good works around the world, to imagine how magical he seemed when he came practically from nowhere in 1976. I think he still has the record for the quickest ascent from 1% name recognition in the United States and 1 year later being sworn in as president. And part of what he was able to do was because he seemed to capture the spirit of that time. He was going to be honest. He was hardworking. He embraced all kinds of culture, black and white. He was a military officer who also was against the Vietnam War. He was a friend of Bob Dylan. He quoted Dylan Thomas. He had Martin Luther King Sr. as one of his supporters. So there was what Democrats would associate with early Barack Obama, or Republicans perhaps with Ronald Reagan. Jimmy Carter had in a pure form when he first came onto the scene.
And yet, Judy Woodruff, as Jim Fallows just said, the magic of Carter's first days wore off. His approval rating dropped from 70% to 28% from 1977 to 1978. Was that, in fact, in part because of the outsider status, perhaps the outsider staff that he brought with him, and it helped create the impression among some that he was frankly out of his league?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with the fact that he didn't really love the idea of bending to the ways of Washington. He brought his team, largely a very loyal Georgia team, with him to Washington. They surrounded him at the White House until about 3 years into the administration, when he finally did bring in some more Washington experienced hands. But you have to say the country was experiencing inflation. Gas prices were high. He was plagued in the last year of his presidency by the terrible Iran hostage crisis, where dozens of Americans at the embassy in Tehran were taken hostage, held for a year. He had the failed helicopter, the attempt to send in helicopters to rescue them, a crash. There were so many things that happened that were bad luck. And you could attribute it to his great ambition, his determination to make a difference against all odds. But part of what happened, I would say, is the fact that he didn't want to bend. He didn't want to do things the way Washington had always done it. To him, it was more important to try to do, quote, the right thing than to worry about what was going to get him reelected.
Kai Bird, on foreign policy, Judy just mentioned the hostages, of course, in Iran, but a signature achievement of President Carter was a peace treaty that he personally helped seal between Egypt and Israel that stands to this day. Do you believe that that is his crowning foreign policy achievement? And how did he stay focused on Israel long after that?
Oh, that was a crowning achievement. It was an extraordinary episode in personal diplomacy. It just wouldn't have happened without Jimmy Carter. And yet, it was an achievement of a cold peace between Israel and Egypt. But people should remember that Carter believed he also got an agreement, a road path to autonomy and maybe a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians, and that Begin reneged on it. And he spent
Begin, the prime minister of Israel that signed the Camp David Accords.
Yes. And Carter just believed that Menachem Begin had promised him one thing and then walked out the door and reneged. And he spent the rest of his life warning the Israelis that they were going down a road towards apartheid if they kept building settlements in the West Bank. And of course, that was not a popular thing to say. But this is Jimmy Carter. He is a prophet in the wilderness, and prophets are often unpopular. And he was relentless. And I have to say, looking at where we are today, I think he's been proven correct. And that's why we still have a terrible conflict in the Middle East today.
Israel, of course, denies that it's got anything to do with apartheid, but I want to keep going. Jim Fallow's other foreign policy legacies, turning over the Panama Canal to Panama, something criticized not only by his opponent, President Reagan, eventually, but also recently by President-elect Trump. We mentioned Iran, of course, normalization with China. How much of Carter's legacy is defined by those topics, and what was most important to him?
So I think in addition to the Camp David Accord, where I agree with what Kai Bird just said, I think that Carter would rank two other achievements near the top in foreign policy. One was the Panama Canal treaties, which, interestingly, the first negotiations on that front had happened under Richard Nixon and at the urging of the U.S. military, which said that unless there were some resolution of this colonialist presence in Panama, it was going to be impossible to defend the canal. And Carter defended that, and he pulled off a work of sort of political legerdemain that we don't usually associate with him in getting 68 votes in the Senate to ratify this, which involved getting a lot of Republicans to join him. So I think that was important. And also his human rights policy, which he announced during the campaign and in a seminal speech at Notre Dame in his first year of the presidency. I think that will stand in the test of time as something that in which he changed the world. Part of what he's recognized for in the Nobel Peace Prize.
The only president of the United States to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his work after being president, Judy Woodruff, when you asked him about his legacy, human rights was one of the main things he brought up, not only during his presidency, but afterward, right?
That's right. He was very proud of, he was not one to brag, but he was very proud of his record on human rights, as Jim Fallows just described. And he also said we kept the peace. And that was one of the central missions of the Carter, has been and is today one of the central missions of the Carter Center, which is housed and based in Atlanta to this day. They've worked in, I think, 60 countries around the world at least, promoting health in some of the poorest parts of the planet, the poorest people on Earth. Those were the people who Jimmy Carter said he wanted to pay attention to. But it was also working to find peace in regions of the world that the bigger countries often overlooked. For him, that was a huge part of what he wanted to do as his legacy. And yes, he did win the Nobel Peace Prize. He was incredibly proud of that. But I have to say one other thing that was so important to him, and that was his own faith. He was a man of Christian faith. When I interviewed him in 2021, Nick, he spoke about how he and Rosalind read verses from the Bible every night and prayed. This was a central piece of who he was. And he said, as long as the American people keep faith, he said, we will continue to have a strong country. So it was something that all of us will identify with him.
Jim Fallows, Kai Bird, Judy Woodruff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The day's other news begins in South Korea, where the acting president today ordered an inspection of the nation's entire aviation sector after yesterday's crash south of Seoul that killed 179 people. Only 2 survived when the Jeju Airlines Boeing 737-800 skidded off the runway and exploded, both of them crew members. Here's Stephanie Tsai.
An anguished man cries out among a sea of forlorn faces. Families of the victims of one of the deadliest air disasters in South Korean history want answers.
What we have to demand from the government is to bring in more experts. We've wanted the government to recover our families 100%, or at least 80%, as soon as possible.
Park Han-shin's brother was one of 181 people on board Jeju Air Flight 7C-2216. It was flying from Bangkok and belly landed in Muon. Without its landing gear deployed, the plane overshot the runway, barreling at high speed straight into a concrete wall. Nearly everyone on board died as the plane burst into flames. Only 2 crew members survived. They were pulled out from the tail of the aircraft.
The bodies are so severely damaged that we're in a situation where we need to recover and piece them together one by one. That's the current reality.
In the packed airport, Jeju Air executive Lee Jung-suk bowed in remorse.
We will take full responsibility and accept any necessary measures. Once again, I offer my deepest apologies.
Today, investigators are sifting through the wreckage for evidence. The black box has been recovered. It could reveal what transpired leading up to the tragic landing, but that data won't yield immediate answers. What is known is that Korean air traffic controllers had warned the pilots of the possibility of a bird strike just before landing. Some experts say that alone is unlikely to be the cause of such a major crash, and other factors bear scrutiny.
I'm pretty shocked, actually, because whatever happened to the airplane, which meant that the pilot couldn't get the flaps and gear down for the landing, was not actually what caused the death of the passengers. The passengers were killed by hitting a solid structure just over the end of the runway, where a solid structure should not be.
The ill-fated plane was a Boeing 737-800 used by 180 airlines around the world, making up about 15% of the global passenger aircraft fleet. The government ordered an inspection of every Boeing 737-800 operating in the country. Boeing said it's in touch with Jeju Air for the investigation. The grim tragedy struck at a time when the country is dealing with political upheaval at the highest level. This month, President Yoon Suk-yeol was impeached after imposing a short-lived martial law decree that angered the nation. The acting president, Choi Sang-mok, has announced a week-long period of mourning. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Stephanie Tsai.
Also today, President Biden announced another $2.5 billion in U.S. military aid to Ukraine, the latest step to help Ukraine's war effort before President-elect Trump takes office next month. The package includes $1.25 billion in missiles, munitions, and other hardware that the U.S. says can be moved to the battlefield quickly. The rest comes in the form of weapons delivered longer term. Separately, the Treasury Department announced $3.4 billion in economic assistance to Ukraine. The military assistance comes as some 300 Ukrainian and Russian captives were freed today in the latest prisoner swap. Some Ukrainian troops had been held since the early days of the war. Today, they reunited with loved ones.
I'm serving and will continue to serve our country, Ukraine. The most important thing is that I am on my land. I saw my country's flag and my family. This is just the best. It's just amazing. After everything that happened to us in Russia, after what they did to us.
Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky thanked the United Arab Emirates for helping to negotiate the exchange. In Afghanistan, the Taliban leadership says it will close all non-governmental organizations, both national and international, that employ Afghan women. The Taliban didn't say exactly why, but have for the last 2 years warned that NGOs have to stop employing women because of concerns they weren't wearing headscarves properly. In a letter published on social media, the Economy Ministry warned that if groups did not cooperate, quote, all activities of that institution will be canceled. Since retaking control of Afghanistan in 2021, the Taliban have barred women from most jobs, from public spaces, and from education after middle school. A federal appeals court upheld a $5 million verdict against President-elect Trump for sexually abusing and defaming E. Jean Carroll. The magazine columnist had claimed Trump assaulted her in a Manhattan department store in the mid-1990s. The three-judge panel found that Trump did not sufficiently make the case that the May 2023 verdict should be thrown out. In a separate case, a jury ordered Trump to pay her more than $83 million in damages for defamation related to the assault accusation. Trump denies any wrongdoing and is still appealing that verdict. The U.S. Treasury Department revealed today that Chinese state hackers stole documents earlier this month in what it called a major incident. A Treasury spokesperson said the hackers, quote, were able to remotely access several Treasury user workstations and certain unclassified documents. In a letter to lawmakers seen by the NewsHour, the department added there is no evidence of continued access to Treasury information. This comes in the wake of a massive Chinese hacking campaign against at least 9 American telecom companies, which U.S. officials admit is still ongoing. China has previously denied any wrongdoing. On Wall Street today, stocks ended lower as traders prepare to close the books on an otherwise strong 2024. The Dow Jones Industrial Average dropped more than 400 points, or nearly 1%. The Nasdaq fell more than 200 points on the day. The S&P 500 also ended in negative territory. And a passing of note, Broadway actress turned sitcom star Linda Lavin has died. In the 1970s and 80s, Lavin played the title character in Alice, delivering a weekly serving of laughs as a diner waitress raising a young son.
Where did you get that?
From Roger. I traded my electric guitar for it.
You what?
He traded his electric I heard him!
The sitcom aired on CBS for nearly a decade, becoming a primetime hit and earning Lavin 2 Golden Globes. Following Alice, she returned to the stage, where in 1987 she won a Tony Award for her performance in Neil Simon's Broadway Bound. Lavin's representative says she died yesterday from complications related to lung cancer. She was 87 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, Tamara Keith and Amy Walter break down the latest political headlines. And literary critics offer their choices for the best and most important books of 2024.
This is the PBS NewsHour from the David M. Rubenstein Studio at WETA in Washington, and in the West from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University.
There is new data out that show the number of murders in this country is declining rapidly. Crime was, of course, a central focus of the presidential election, with President-elect Trump portraying crime as out of control. And a majority of Americans believe that crime is increasing. William Brangham is here with a look at what the numbers tell us. William?
Nick, data collected from hundreds of law enforcement agencies show the murder rate dropped 16% compared to last year. In San Francisco, homicides have fallen by a third. Chicago recorded its lowest number of murders since 2019. And rates of other crimes also fell. Car thefts declined by roughly 20%. For a closer look at what this means, we are joined by crime data analyst Jeff Asher. He's the co-founder of AH Datalytics and creator of the Real-Time Crime Index. Jeff Asher, so good to have you on the program. When you look at all of this data that you analyzed, what stood out to you the most?
I think the scope of the decline in murder stands out, certainly. Right now, we have over 300 cities worth of data through October showing murder down 16%. Last year, the FBI had murder down 12%. For some context, the largest one-year decline ever recorded prior to last year was a 9% decline in 1996. So it's not just that we're seeing a decline in murder. It's not just that we're seeing murder relatively returning to where it was pre-pandemic, but we're seeing by far the fastest one-year declines last year and then again this year. And it's been a phenomenal trend to be able to follow.
What is your understanding as to what is the most plausible explanation for what is driving this decline?
I think the most plausible explanation is a combination of, one, just sort of everyday life getting back to normal, the stresses specific to the pandemic going away, and two, a lot of the tools that we would ordinarily use, both policing and non-policing, to interrupt these cycles of violence, which sort of erupted in the summer of 2020. We didn't have those tools in 2020 and 2021, and even much of 2022. Now we have those tools at our disposal, and in a lot of cities, we're seeing murder and gun violence return to and even exceed where it was pre-pandemic.
We're seeing also, as I mentioned, declines in other types of crimes, but overall crime declines, they were not universal. There are some places that saw either a plateauing or an uptick. Isn't that right?
Sure. I think we're looking at places like Charlotte, North Carolina, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that had increasing murders. But for the most part, those are the outliers, and they're notable because they're the outliers. I believe in the latest real-time crime index, we had 40 cities that had seen a double-digit decline in murders and only 5 cities that had seen a double-digit increase. There's other types of crime that are maybe not seen as significant declines in terms of robbery and aggravated assault. We're seeing significant declines in burglary, theft, and a huge decline in motor vehicle theft after 4 years of increases. So yes, you can always point to things that maybe are either around even or even increasing in various cities, but with the majority of cities, the pattern tends to be decreases across the board.
Your analysis and all of the work that you do is clearly built on giving the average citizen a better window into what crime really does look like, both nationally and in their own city. But as you know, the perception of crime, people believe the opposite of what your data indicate. How do you explain that?
I think there's lots of little things that add up. The first is that there's a data vacuum. We don't have a lot of good, strong data, and that's the vacuum that we're hoping that projects like the Real-Time Crime Index can fill. The FBI doesn't put out its year-end numbers until 9 months after the most recent year ended. So, one, you're asking people to essentially not use data and use anecdotes, and they're always going to have a bias towards how many murders have I seen on the news recently rather than how many murders did I see last year at this time. I think other challenges, the media doesn't cover the planes that land. There's rarely stories, and I've done far fewer of these interviews where you're talking about declines in murder, even though it's a record decline, than were being done in 2020 and 2021, where we're seeing big increases in murder, big increases in gun violence. And then you talked about at the beginning, partisanship is playing a role. 90% of Republicans, 28% of Democrats, and 60-something% of independents think that crime rose over the last year. And we're not seeing necessarily enormous just crime disappearing from American society. So you would expect to see maybe a 40, maybe 50% of the public thinking crime rose, that you have this enormous gap between how Democrats and Republicans see perceptions suggests that they're being fed very different stories about what's actually happening in terms of crime in the country.
What is your sense as far as the practical impact of people not understanding reality with regards to crime? I mean, what difference does it make?
Well, I think it has enormous differences in terms of, one, it's not healthy for people to be afraid. It's not healthy for people to think that they're going to get mugged every day or that they live in some crime-ridden dumpster that nobody would want to live in, when reality is things may be in their city getting a lot better. I think the other real challenge is that if we create a world where either crime is rising or the data is wrong, then we're never able to understand why are things getting better. Is it something we're doing? Is it randomness? Is it a policy that nobody's thinking of that's having an effect that we didn't expect? How can we understand successes is just as important as how can we identify and reverse failures? Because if we're having successful reduction policies, it's really a shame on us if we let this moment pass without seeing why these are happening and what we can do to extend it and what we can do to make this happen in places that are not currently seeing declines.
All right, Jeff Asher of the Real-Time Crime Index, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
As 2025 is about to begin, we look ahead at the political landscape to come and back at the year that was with our Politics Monday team, Amy Walter of the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter and Tamara Keith of NPR. Thanks very much. Welcome to you both. Tam, let me start with you. Jimmy Carter had 40 years to define his legacy after the White House. Not only does Biden not have that much time, but is there a recognition that, in fact, Biden's successor could help define Biden's legacy?
Absolutely. President Carter really gave himself a new legacy, a second legacy. 40 years is an incredibly long time. President Biden does not have 40 years. The actuarial tables tell us that's basically impossible. And so his presidency is likely to be defined both by what he did in office, but increasingly by how his time in office came to an end. He ran in 2019 for president to make Donald Trump a one-term president. That was why he ran. That is what he said. And now Donald Trump will be a two-term president. History remembers two-term presidents generally more fondly than they remember one-term presidents. And I've spoken to several presidential historians who say that President Biden, much of the fate of his legacy may well be defined by how people ultimately perceive Donald Trump. But right now, if you ask, he was the dragon slayer, as one historian told me, but then he also is the man who let the dragon back in. That, at least, is the perception from this historian I spoke to.
Amy Walter, is Biden uniquely, perhaps, vulnerable to have a legacy written by his successor?
Well, certainly in this most recent era where we've had some pretty young presidents. We also have Bill Clinton, who left office in his 50s, much like Jimmy Carter did, who's been able to watch his own legacy be written and rewritten almost every few years. George W. Bush also leaving office at a relatively young age. And of course, Barack Obama. So this is unique in our recent era, but we've certainly had presidents who soon after they left office, maybe they were defined by, I'm thinking of Lyndon Baines Johnson, things about their presidency that were the most unpopular. And then years and years and years later, their legacy is redefined by some of the other accomplishments they had. I think what's also fascinating in looking at Biden and Carter in the same lens for a second, both of them were felled by a similar issue, which is inflation. Both of them as one-term presidents. But, if you look back and you look at what happened with Jimmy Carter, both when he came into office and after he left, he was really an outsider and really enjoyed and embraced that outsiderness, going back to Plains, Georgia, of course, right after he left the White House. Biden will be remembered for being the consummate insider whose life was defined by Washington.
Congress returns at the end of the week, and the first item on the agenda is choosing the House Speaker. President-elect Trump today, through his support behind the incumbent, Mike Johnson, writing this message on a social media platform, quote, "He is a good, hardworking, religious man. He will do the right thing, and we will continue to win. Mike has my complete and total endorsement." With such a narrow margin in the House, Tam, does this get Johnson over the top?
Well, it's not clear yet. We do know of at least one House member who has said, House Republican, who has said he will not support Johnson. We also know that House Democrats are not planning to bail him out. Johnson faced another challenge to his speakership, and Democrats at that point did step in and support him. This time, they feel burned by the deal at the end of the year, right before the holidays, to keep the government funded. It was supposed to do a bunch of other things. It was a bipartisan deal. It blew up in part because of Trump and Musk, but Democrats left that saying, well, we can't trust Johnson. So he won't have Democrats to help. Trump, this is going to be a test of Trump's sway with his party, with Republicans, because Trump also said that he wanted the debt limit to be extended, and he wanted that done, and the decks cleared before he came into office. And 38 House Republicans voted against that. So this will be a test. We will see. But Trump has every reason to not want a leadership battle right now because he wants to hit the ground running, and a leadership battle will distract and make it harder for Republicans to have the kind of unity they are going to have with that narrow majority in order to get the things done that he wants done.
Amy Walter, can Trump avoid the leadership battle?
Tim said it perfectly there. At the end, he can't really afford for this to go off the rails. Look, I think this is going to be a constant in this Trump second term, is this push and pull between Trump wanting to be the disruptor. That is something that he enjoys. It's something he campaigned on. And it's something we saw in his first term. And as Tim pointed out, this is also what we saw at the end of the year, disrupting at the very end of the process this deal on the funding for the government and potentially a debt ceiling raise. He also, though, the pull side, if we do that was the push, the pull side is wanting to accomplish something now that he has coming into office, very narrow, but still a Republican majority in the House and in the Senate. Does he want to be a disruptor? Does he want to be a doer? He can't get a whole lot done in his first 2 years if what is happening is constant friction and constant disruption, intra-party friction and disruption that he may help to stoke. So in this case, he's seeing the importance of lining up behind a speaker, preventing that disruption in this area. But I don't think that this means that we're not going to see the disruption side sometimes overruling the doer side.
We've got about a minute and a half left, so you each have 45 seconds. Amy, you first. Tam, you first. We're wrapping up 2024. Biggest political highlight of the year.
Highlight. Well, I'm going to go with some surprises. And there were many of them. This was a year of political surprises. I think the ultimate surprise in the election result was that after 2 elections where Donald Trump never broke 47%, where he was pretty much stuck at 47%, he broke 47%. He exceeded what was thought to be his ceiling with an effective campaign and obviously the help of inflation and a desire for change among American voters. Obviously, the other huge surprise was President Biden's performance in that debate. Just a devastating performance that, people were trying to say, well, maybe he could do okay. Maybe it won't be the best, but he'll be okay. No one was predicting that it would be that bad and that it would have those sorts of consequences. Though actually, I will say, lots of voters were predicting that somehow Joe Biden would get out of the race well before that happened. Those voters were right.
Amy, political highlight of the year in about 25 seconds?
Yeah, I think it was that the Republican success was decisive, but also continues to be very, very narrow. Look, control of the House came down to, at the end of the day, about 7,000 votes split across the 3 most competitive races. Push those the other way, Democrats had control of the House. In the presidential race, Trump won a decisive victory, won the popular vote, but it was really thanks to about 229,000 voters in those blue wall states that gave him the electoral
out of
college
155 million.
That's right. So that is very narrow. And I think this is the reality that we have to continue to remind ourselves that we live in an era of politics that is fought here on the margins, and the smallest margins seem to be the most important.
Amy Walter, Tamara Keith, thanks very much to you both.
You're welcome.
This holiday shopping season, Americans were projected to spend 7% more than last year. But our Paul Salman was alerted to a social media trend that, in a world of consumerism, hits pause before pressing the purchase button.
Get ready with me to go on a shopping spree.
The perennial end-of-year messages we've just had to endure in print, on TV, and all over social media. Buy away, buy away, buy away all.
Let's do the biggest shopping haul ever!
We're gonna go self-care shopping at Sephora, Ulta, Target.
This is everything that I got. Let's go through it quickly.
But here's what's also been trending this year: Hashtag underconsumption core.
I wanted to show you stuff that I've had for literal decades. My Chi hair straightener from 2010, 2011, somewhere in there. Still works great.
Counter-trender Diana Wiebe was posting videos like this one.
You can see I've hit pan on a couple of these, couple of my faves, but it's still good. It's rejecting what influencers and the companies behind them are trying to get you to do, which is buy more and buy it right now.
It's a younger generation's reaction to America's throwaway culture. Buy less, repurpose, shop vintage, instead of plunging reflexively for...
I'm just gonna be the first one to say it, I guess. Garbage.
Of course, Wiebe is hardly the first to say it, or the first to push underconsumption.
I don't think it's new at all. It's what we have called in the past living within our means.
Brett House, economics professor at Columbia University's Business School.
I think it's worth noting that if there's underconsumption happening anywhere, it's almost certainly for people at lower incomes who are facing greater challenges in covering their day-to-day needs. If we look at past cycles between booms and recessions, in the wake of any slowdown, we have seen people focus more on cleaning up their debt, reducing consumption, and aligning expenses with their incomes.
Same for garbage products made to expire.
We've seen products with defined life cycles hit the market for decades.
Built-in obsolescence, it's called, a term coined nearly a century ago. But hey, how better to keep the hamster wheel of consumerism spinning? Problem is, says Wiebe, it's getting worse.
I have seen a decline in quality just over my lifetime. I'm only 30 years old, but I can see when things are not made as well as they once were.
And online shopping has never been easier. One click, payment info already saved, for products increasingly pushed by influencers posing as your friends.
TikTok just sent me a notification that the Juvia's Place blush is $9. Go get it right now, bestie.
They see people having the newest water bottles, the newest fashion, the newest shoes or handbags, and they want those things.
Consumer researcher Melissa Bublitz.
This idea of advertising is not new, but I think what is new is the amount of time and the wide variety of exposure that our young people have to this influencer culture.
Look, way back in 1960, the waste makers urged resistance to built-in obsolescence in the spirit of sustainability. 2 years later, Dr. Seuss rhymed about the exhausted Zizzerzoof salesman. All day they've raced round in the heat at top speeds, unsuccessfully trying to sell Zizzerzoof seeds, which nobody wants because nobody needs.
We as consumers in, more privileged countries buy 5 times more clothing today than we bought in 1990, which means that something has changed in our buying habits as well.
That beautiful sweater you're wearing, how long have you had that?
8 going on 9 years, maybe?
Aja Barber is the author of Consumed, a critique of what we buy and how it's created.
I've always shopped secondhand. It just wasn't very cool. I remember getting clothing from eBay in the early 2000s when I was a university student and keeping that a bit of a secret from some of my peers who would think it was icky. So it's always been the way some of us have done it. It's just now become a part of a larger conversation on a planet that is in duress.
As it turns out, 92 million tons of clothing end up in landfills every year. And every year, automation will make products, this shirt say, cheaper. Not to mention overproduction that's already peddled at absurdly low prices by Chinese e-commerce companies like Temu and AliExpress, all of which leading to more waste.
Looking at all of the clothing that was being pushed on myself and others, I began to wonder where this clothing was going. I soon learned that there are places in the global south that end up with mountains of our clothing, and it is not something that is needed or wanted.
So I do see just in my own interactions with people who I'm talking to that they want to consume less. They want to be more mindful of when they're being advertised to.
Diana Wiebe's following has swelled from 1,000 to more than 200,000. the meme prompting more than 20,000 posts on TikTok alone. But here's the rub. It hasn't made much of an impact on overall consumer spending, says researcher Bublitz.
We don't see consumption going down. In fact, our population's growing by less than 1%, but our consumer spending is growing, at least 5%.
If anything, we've seen slightly higher than normal consumption, not underconsumption in the big numbers we look at.
But it's still a perfectly good mug.
So, is the meme all for naught? No, insists de-influencer Weeby.
My hope is that people don't necessarily treat it as underconsumption core as a trend, but rather just like my normal lifestyle is not buying things instantaneously or in great quantities.
For the PBS NewsHour, Paul Salman, a bit bummed to have overconsumed yet again this year while doing this very story.
And finally tonight, 'tis the season for year-end lists. And our Jeffrey Brown sat down with two of our regular literary critics to highlight their favorite books of 2024 for our arts and culture coverage, Canvas.
It's been another year of great releases across a number of genres, and to help us recap the highlights, we're joined now by two familiar faces. Maureen Corrigan, book critic for NPR's Fresh Air, and Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Nice to see both of you at this time of year. Let's start with my own favorite, because I get to choose. That's fiction. So, Gilbert, you want to start us off with a couple of fiction picks?
Absolutely. It's good to see you both. The first book I want to talk about is a book some of you may have heard of. It's called All Fours by Miranda July. It certainly was a big book this summer. It's kind of a wacky premise. You have a middle-aged female artist who decides to take a road trip from LA to New York, 20 minutes outside of town. She stops at a motel, decides to completely redo the motel, becomes obsessed with a younger man, and the story takes off from there. It's a crazy start, but in the end, it's a very serious book about what it means to be middle-aged, particularly middle-aged woman, what it means to be a parent and a mother, what it means to have desire and be desired as you approach middle age. And while humor is very subjective, I found it very funny. It was quite an entertaining read.
All right, how about one more?
Sure. I love books in translation. There was one that came out earlier this year called You Dreamed of Empires. This is by Alvaro Enrique, translated by Natasha Wimmer. And it takes place in what is now Mexico City. It was then called Tenochtitlan. In 1519, Hernan Cortez has just rolled into town with all of his soldiers, and he meets the Aztec Emperor, Moctezuma. You have these two cultures coming together. There's this threat of violence that hangs over the whole thing, but there's also this comedy of manners element to the entire book. For Cortez and his people, they're wondering, are we speaking, the right language with our translators? Are they going to kill us? For the Aztecs, they're looking at these horses. They've never seen them before. It's a sort of a fascinating melange of different tones that Enrique puts together. Incredible book.
All right, Maureen. So he went with very contemporary and historical fiction back to Cortez. What have you got?
Well, I've got, in a sense, historical fiction and very contemporary, too. James by Percival Everett, which I think has landed on so many best of lists this year.
National Book Award winner.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And it's a retelling, in a sense, of Huckleberry Finn, but from the point of view of James, the enslaved person in the novel. I usually am suspicious of these kinds of appropriations of classic texts and, through the point of view of a secondary character. This is alive. It is very much its own novel. It's funny. It's heartfelt. I mean, the opening scene is James educating young children in the community how to speak through a slave filter so that white people will listen to them. And it really makes you rethink Huckleberry Finn in ways you can't even anticipate. So that's one.
Okay.
And then this is a peculiar year, right? Danzy Senna's Colored Television. Danzy Senna happens to be married to Percival Everett.
Yes,
so I would
you're
love to
showing a lot of love to this household.
I would love to hear their dinner table conversations. really sharp social commentary, funny, satirical. It's about a woman who, mixed race, who was trying to write this epic novel about what it means to be mixed race in America. And she's not having any success with the novel. So she decides to sell out. She lives in LA, she goes to TV. Such a smart novel about the writing life and also about class as well as race. I mean, what it means to have a lot of cultural capital without a lot of financial capital, which is the plight of a lot of writers.
And NewsHour viewers know we had both of them on this show. Gilbert Cruz, what about nonfiction?
So The Wide, Wide Sea by Hampton Sides is about the third and final voyage of Captain James Cook. Captain Cook, very, very well-known British explorer. This is the journey that he took from England in 1776 to the South Pacific, in part to return a Tahitian man or a man from those islands to his home island, but also to try to find the Northwest Passage, which, as you both know, was a thing that people really tried to do back then. And it's one of those classic pieces of historical nonfiction that anyone who loves seafaring adventure will enjoy, but it also has that very sort of necessary realization of what it means to, have engaged in these sort of imperialist endeavors back then. And so, it has a modern understanding of history while also being incredibly detail-oriented and incredibly entertaining. So that's one. And the other one I'll talk about is very contemporary. It is Everyone Who Has Gone Is Here by Jonathan Blitzer. We just came out of a presidential election in which the immigration situation at the southern border was one of the key sort of points of debate. And what Blitzer, who is a staff writer at The New Yorker, has done is put together a history of a half century of the situation at the U.S.-Mexico border. It focuses on three Central American nations, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. And through administrations, Republican and Democrat, it sort of tells a story of how we've gotten to the point where we are today.
All right, Maureen Corrigan, to nonfiction?
Yeah, A Wilder Shore by Camille Perry. It tells the story of the marriage of Robert Louis Stevenson and Fanny Stevenson, and she is the star of the show in this telling.
It's her story.
It's her story, as it should be. I mean, she was a woman who really fled from an abusive marriage, went to Europe on no money, decided she wanted to be an artist, taking her 3 children with her, met Stevenson, and we go on from there. But it is an inspiring story about having a larger life. So that's one. The other suggestion is the new edition of the Letters of Emily Dickinson, which Harvard's Belknap Press has brought out.
The Letters of Emily Dickinson.
Yes, 300 new letters have been collected that we haven't seen before. It's the closest thing we're ever likely to get to an autobiography by Dickinson. And I tell you, you can't put it down.
Wow, I wasn't expecting that. Okay, so I want to give you each, in the time we have left, a bonus pick, okay? So whatever, maybe a book that just didn't get as much attention as you hoped, but that you tell your close friends, you got to read this. Gilbert Cruz, you want to pick one?
Absolutely. So a book that came out sort of late in the year that I really enjoyed is called Carla's Choice. It's by Nick Harkaway, and it's a new John le Carré story. So John le Carré died in 2020. His son, Nick Harkaway, is also a writer. He's a novelist known primarily for science fiction work, and he has written a new story starring George Smiley. So George Smiley, one of the most famous spy protagonists of all time, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and all of those books. This is set in the period between The Spy Who Came In From the Cold and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. And he does just a remarkable job of not really mimicking his father's voice as much as inhabiting it. And it tells a story of George Smiley and his nemesis on the Soviet side, Carla. It was quite entertaining.
All right, Maureen, final bonus pick.
Okay, this is out of the box for me.
Out of the box.
The Dog Who Followed the Moon by James Norbury. It's an illustrated, inspirational book for adults. And it's really all about a dog who's lost and follows the moon and doesn't know where he's going to end up. For those of us who are feeling a little lost these days and unsure about what paths to take, the illustrations are gorgeous. And I guess inspiring is my theme for my picks this year. I found it very inspiring.
All right. Great picks, as always. Maureen Corrigan, Gilbert Cruz. Thank you both very much, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
Thank you.
Later this evening on PBS, American Experience presents an encore broadcast of its documentary, Jimmy Carter. The film traces his life as president from a rapid ascent to a dramatic downfall. And it chronicles his many achievements in the decades following his presidency as statesman and humanitarian. Jimmy Carter airs tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern on PBS. Check your local listings. And as always, we have much more online. That includes 2024 song recommendations from some of the music industry's most decorated artists and producers, and that is on our Instagram. And that's the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Nick Schifrin. I hope you had a good day. On behalf of the entire NewsHour team, thank you for joining us. Have a great night.
Major funding for the PBS NewsHour has been provided by the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, committed to building a more just, verdant, and peaceful world. More information at macfound.org. And with the ongoing support of these institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.